Welcome to The Conversation. My name is Shannon Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of Blacks and Jews in Conversation. Our special guest today is George Torodash. He is the Chief Retired of the Criminal Intelligence Division of New York State Parole. And I wouldn't want to get caught by this guy when he was in active service. He is now a professor. And George, where are you a professor?
Mercy College.
And, of course, of criminal justice.
That's correct. Criminal justice and psychology.
But before we get into the psychology of criminal justice, I would like to say a few words about a very dear member of my family, Beatrice Drexler, who passed on the last couple of days at the young age of 92. And in her case, it was a young age. She was a tremendous inspiration and source of strength, not only for her very large and accomplished family, and one member was a guest on this show, Lee Drexler, the praiser, you may remember, with credentials that extend throughout the country, and including Europe and so on. But she was, of course, a great inspiration for my mother and myself. My mother loved her dearly, and that transferred itself to me. Since my very youngest years, I actually went to the camp that she founded, Candy Mountain Day Camp, and for such as I to get exercise in those years, it really had to be inspiration. As was said so movingly at the service today, you had a playground for kids in days when there were no playgrounds. 50 acres of the most pristine woodland in the most marvelous areas of Muncie and New City. Now the woodlands are gone, the trees are cut, and every blade of grass has been made into an athletic field. And still the children come, and thousands upon tens of thousands of people have been there and remember it so very fondly. And this was a day when women didn't do too much. Even the most accomplished women, like my mother who went to college, they got married and they settled into home. My mother-in-law, the same thing, who was in the Secret Service in Europe. They got married and they settled into home life, not B. B didn't settle into anything. She remained active at all times. And with her devoted husband, Eli Drexler, who was a pioneer with Fujifilm and went to the Oscars with it for The Black Stallion, they pioneered every field of endeavor that they could. And no risk was too awesome. And in her later years, she went into a third life traveling throughout the world, to the Galapagos, where she took her grandson Brett, and to a safari in Africa, where she took her grandson Billy. And when her granddaughter Michelle was in an accident in Portugal, there she was in Portugal to see her through the hospitals. There was nothing beyond her. And with a positive outlook, that didn't transfer itself on to me, of course, but with a positive outlook, that is what everybody today encourages. Today they say, don't go to your psychiatrist, go to the positive outlook person. Well, that would have been B. And to her family and to her many, many legacies, I salute you, and we could all take many lessons from her life, from her brother Arthur, who is now, I believe, at the age of 89. I thank him for having introduced me over and over again to his wonderful sisters V and Hilda, who herself was an accomplished sculpturist. This was a family that was so artistic, it rivaled my relatives in Israel, also filled with artistry, and I just try and play catch-up, and it's not easy. So therefore we have this TV show to bring you an education into all these endeavors and encourage you that there is nothing beyond you. There was a time when women weren't invited anywhere, and she formed this camp that now is a legacy for the whole country. And now we have women judges where you couldn't have a female judge beating down a door no matter what. And you've turned around from slavery and into black civil rights, and you've turned around for Jews. They're now not just in fields of magic and entertainment, but they now own the law firms. And so on and so forth, with the Hispanic community now coming into its own. But it started with the suffragette movement, perhaps. and B is a good case in point. God bless you, and we should all have such a positive, long life with the strength to overcome all the many hardships that she did. And thank you. And now, George, it's time for you, and you represent a side of life that unfortunately accompanies all the good. It's like a parallel universe. It's the parallel universe that I work in. It's the criminal side of life. It's not the good and the positive, but you want to make it into the positive. You want to reform it. So tell me first of all what your experiences were, and then we'll get into how we can make it better today.
Well, first of all, I was in law enforcement for 40 years, both as a street officer, as a chief of intelligence, and as a union leader. And unfortunately, I saw fewer and fewer Jews. However, a lot of people are unaware that I think the most decorated police officer in New York City is a Jewish fellow who's retired now on disability. One of the most successful FBI agents was an individual named Joe Yablonsky, and the most successful DEA agent in history, Michael Levine, and several other Jews excelled in this field. The only problem is it's not widely known in our community, and I am trying to convince young Jewish men and women to enter into the field. Let me just recite quickly an old folklore, an old tale, that when the Jews first came over here, and some of the young men were going on to the police force, the community, for the most part, objected to it. They felt that this was a continuation of Tsarist Russia's policies, where the Jews were the victims of the police, not they weren't protected. So they complained to the head of the community at that time, of course, was the old, venerable, wise rabbi who knew all, said all, and solved all problems. And the community expressed their objections. Then the rabbi turned to the community leaders who didn't want the Jews to go into law enforcement and said, "Look, do we have any Jewish criminals?" And they said, "Yes, unfortunately we do." And the rabbi said, "Well, who do you want to catch them, our own boys or the Gentiles?" And supposedly that settled the argument. Since then, Jews have excelled in law enforcement, but not in large numbers. And frankly, the numbers are not growing. We can't all be doctors, we can't all be lawyers, we can't all be accountants, nor do we want to be. If you want to get rich, forget about law enforcement, but you can make a very decent living. After a few years, most of these jobs pay $65,000, $70,000, and that's before promotions. It's a dynamic job. You'll have the satisfaction of helping people, of being a part of society, not just selling products for money. There are a lot of tremendous benefits which people are not quite aware of. Pensions. You can retire after 20 or 25 years from most of these positions, and you're still a relatively young person, male or female, and you can get on with another career. Sick leave. The sick leave benefits are tremendous. In some of the departments, they are unlimited. Health insurance is usually paid for the most part by the agencies. Vacation. After a few years, you get approximately 30 days vacation, and 35 sometimes. And with the weekends, that means you're going to be away about 6 weeks if you like. And again, you have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the safety of society, that you're engaged in a dynamic profession, and that as far as danger, forget about the nonsense on television. Believe me, every half hour or every case, you're not involved in a shootout with a bunch of bad guys. Most law enforcement officers have never fired a gun except at the range throughout their career. I fired mine once at someone in 40 years. And basically, you have the permission and the ability to carry firearms, which means you're safer than most people, because if you're accosted, if you're attacked, you have the means to defend yourself. So basically, there's nothing negative about law enforcement. There is also a flexibility of hours in many of these jobs.
Let me interject here.
Sure.
We have situations today where officers are in shootouts with 50 bullets, 40 bullets, 60 bullets, 30 bullets, and then you read that they never used their gun. You read that they never had to use their gun. And all of a sudden they're in a situation where they had to use their gun. Then you have commissions of inquiry, and why didn't you use your gun, and what was the situation, and invariably these are racial inquiries. Now, I'm not permitted to comment on ongoing cases, but we have had closed cases, such as the Diallo situation, where the officers were eventually vindicated, but it almost tore the city apart. We held the Hispanic heritage situation at the Bronx Courthouse under the wonderful administrative judge Gonzalez, his first months there, and we had Commissioner Safer there with Ralph Felder and Michael Bodden, the autopsy expert, and we had 300 kids, Hispanic and African American, and dialoguing on these and other issues. But I don't know if we could do that again today, because it's so much more heated. If an incident happens that doesn't even approach that, it's so much more heated because you used 40 bullets. That's all we want to know about. You had a gun and that was it. And what kind of training do these people have? Now, before you answer that, I want to review a New York Post editorial on you. You were 40 years as a parole officer.
Correct.
You arrested more than 1,000 fugitives.
Right.
My grandmother, Bertha Feller, from this family, she never came across a fugitive in her life. I mean, this family could have handled themselves. Amanya and Bertha and Lily and all the rest of them, they could have handled themselves, but certainly not with guns. And as a union official, you helped remedy racial splits between black and white officers negotiating strong contracts. Now, could you do that today? In the climate we have today, it's very different as far as I can tell. Everything is as a tinderbox.
Let me correct you. It was always difficult. Right now, because a lot of things happened recently, it appears that it's a tinderbox. I remember way back in 1962, there were riots when a lieutenant named Gilligan shot a young black individual who came at him with a knife. There were riots, and there were calls for his firing and for indicting him. So there's always the possibility, as long as you have these so-called racial hustlers, instead of trying to objectively examine the facts, they would like to come down on the officer. As far as officers engaging in what is called excessive force, you're not there. Sometimes it's very difficult. It's very easily, of course, after the fact to judge, well, he shouldn't have fired that many. Sometimes it's a problem of training. There's also another problem which a lot of people are unaware of. Standards have been lowered for all of these agencies in recent years. And they're hiring people sometimes who do not have, frankly, the psychological strengths to handle these situations. And that's why maybe you will have people using excessive force. I use that in quotes, excessive force, of course, or firing more than they should, according to reporters or according to onlookers or according to protesters. Again, we can't really judge a situation simply by reading the press reports or by listening to the protesters. It's unfortunate, but there is a lot more gratuitous violence today than there was a generation ago. I remember when I was, in fact, when I was just starting in the business, if somebody pointed a gun at someone and said, hand over your money, or else, you handed over your money and you walked away. That usually happened. However, in the last several years, almost a generation now, you can hand over your money and you still took the risk of getting shot, injured, or killed. So again, unfortunately, there's a lot more animosity, a lot more racial tensions today being fueled by racial hustlers, and there seems to be a lot more viciousness among certain people, certain age groups, and officers have to deal with that. Whether we like it or not, we had to deal with it. And a good officer with training who is sound psychologically should be able to. I mean, I've done it myself. Most of my colleagues have done it. And hopefully we won't have any, or at least not too many more of these incidents.
Your profile in the Post goes on to say that originally this type of job had mostly white officers.
Yes.
But in the 1970s, there were a lot more African American and Hispanic parole officers coming on.
Right.
And that, in turn, led to racial strife. Now, as a union president of the Parole Officers Association in the 1970s and 80s, you became a voice of calm. Would you explain how you become a voice of calm? Now, Bee was never, I would say, a voice of calm, but she was certainly a voice of strength. How were you a voice of calm? I am never a voice of calm.
Well, first of all, if you're a union leader, especially in a law enforcement agency, you have to be a voice of calm, or else you are going to have no voice at all. But basically, It wasn't difficult. I simply let the blacks know that, and the Hispanics also, know that they were welcome and that they deserved everything that the whites deserved. And any time an issue came up, I tried to resolve it fairly, and I never had a problem. And that's why every time I ran for office, I got just about 99% of the black and Hispanic vote. It wasn't difficult, believe me. And many of them I remain friends with to this day. We're at each other's weddings, we're at each other's homes, and there was always a certain bond among law enforcement officers. After all, black, white, or Hispanic, you are depending sometimes on someone watching your back and protecting your life, and you better have a good rapport and a good relationship with them. And I realized that. I never had a problem relating to people who were different than I am.
Now, you retired just recently.
4 years ago.
4 years ago, well, after 40 years, it's rather recent,
Right.
as the chief of the division of the Parole Bureau's Criminal Intelligence Unit.
Right.
And do you enjoy being a professor, a teacher in criminal? How does that compare with criminal intelligence and being a
Okay.
professor and teaching psychiatry? And does the 40 years help you to understand the criminal mind, or is it beyond understanding?
No, to the extent possible that you can understand the criminal mind, it certainly helped a lot. Being a professor is very satisfying because I feel I'm passing on the knowledge I gained in 40 years to the new people who are going to be moving into these positions. As far as being a professor goes also, it's a lot easier, believe me, than being on the streets and dealing with psychopathic individuals. But both positions are very enjoyable, and a lot of people don't realize, they didn't believe me sometimes. I would tell them that if I hit the lottery for $50 million, I would have been at work the next day. I probably would have had a couple of new suits, maybe a new car, but I loved being on those streets, and so do many of the other officers. Not all, but they took to it, they did the best they could, and they really did a tremendous job. They were unsung heroes. They protected the community. They were out there every day. And many of our Jewish officers, many of them, did tremendous work. And I will always appreciate the fact that they supported me, and I supported them.
So you represent the gut reactions of the family I mentioned.
Mhm.
They had plenty of income. They don't have to work as hard as they did. Certainly Bea didn't, but she always wanted to. She always wanted to be active and she was a percussionist. Almost all her life I introduced her to percussion so that I could have a set of timpani that I could practice on. So she immediately got the kettle drums that she liked, and I went to her homes, and there were the drums, and I practiced on them because I had no place to put kettle drums, not to mention to afford them. And she went into orchestras, and I would go in and out of orchestras. She stayed with the same ones. And it's this stick-to-itiveness that apparently characterizes people of your drive. Now, you mentioned that you help keep people from going back into jail, to bring them back into society, people who didn't belong in jail. Tell about the parole office. What exactly is the function of the parole office? I remember learning in college that there are there's rehabilitation, there's retribution, there's incarceration. What of those is the function of parole?
Okay, basically, the main function of parole is very simple: protection of the community. Now, you could do it in a couple of ways. Throughout most of these criminals' lives, they had an absence of order and restraint. The parole officer enforces those traits upon the paroled individual, but he also adds guidance. And the fact is that many psychologists have a theory that the parole officer becomes the superego. I don't want to get too much into psychology of the paroled individual. What do I mean by that? Many times, these people had no one they could trust or really talk to. And many times, they would not commit crimes because they did not want to embarrass or disappoint the parole officer. In fact, there was an empirical study by a former corrections commissioner, Stephen Chinlin, and people who came back to prison, he used to interview, and invariably he'd ask them, when did you think you were returning to criminal activity? When did you think you were going to lapse back? And he said practically everyone would say, the day I finished my parole supervision. In other words, no one was over there to watch over them. No one was there to hold them accountable. Many times, parole officers would get requests by criminals. They'd say, "Look, somebody stole my television set. Is it okay if I break their heads?" And of course, the parole officer would tell him that that was completely forbidden. But without that parole officer, he would have broken the head and he would have been placed back in prison. And parole success, especially considering what they're dealing with, is very high. And it should be expanded. And again, that's why I'm trying to induce more Jewish boys and girls, actually young men and women, into the parole division, into the police force, into the courts, into the state police, into the FBI, into the Treasury Department. And again, it's a rewarding career. You're doing something worthwhile, and it's something you could really enjoy.
I always admired the FBI, especially when they caught all the major terrorists of the last 90s. And as you know, we were both at the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Unfortunately.
And great tragedy.
Tragic.
And I took photographs, and I was involved, therefore, with both the U.S. Attorney's Office, Manager White, and the great office of District Attorney Morgenthau. And these unending trials, when they finally would take place, and there was no more government opposition to the retrial of Noser, who was the assassin, now admitted assassin of Rabbi Kahane. What are your reflections? I found out just now that you were involved in identification of Noser. What are your reflections of that?
Obviously, the case initially was not handled too well from the beginning. First of all, there was not enough security, there was not enough protection. Noser almost got away, but by sheer luck, I believe a postal police officer was on the scene and he was able to shoot Noser. Unfortunately, it wasn't fatal, and Noser was apprehended then. I thought the case was mishandled because obviously Noser, I think, only got about 5 years for that situation. I think because of the altercation with the postal police officer, he was really not convicted at that time
Well,
of
let
the
me
murder
just
of the
interrupt.
rabbi. Sure.
First of all, it was fortunate he didn't die, so they had him in jail to get all the information after
Okay.
the World Trade Center went up. And life in jail to me is much worse than the getting shot down. Secondly, it was 7.5 years because I took pictures of his gun, which the police casually disposed of one way or another, and therefore he got another 1.5 years. He was 7.5 years there, which kept him just enough past the first explosion of the World Trade Center. If he had had 5 years, he would have been long gone with his records, and we'd never
Right.
know anything. But I'm particularly concerned with your identification, because I believe you told me that they found the greatest models of Noser. If you went to a modeling agency, you couldn't find such replicas.
When they asked me to identify him, they showed me 4 people sitting in a room, and I was supposed to look at them through a two-way mirror. One of them obviously wasn't Noser. The other 3, they could have been triplets. You cannot 100% identify which one was Noser. I don't know where they got them. Maybe they were triplets. I don't know. But it was impossible, frankly, to make a 100% identification of Noser.
And I also believe you said you were sitting next to who turned out to be Noser during
Yes.
the lecture by Rabbi.
Yes, but I left early. I remember Noser, I thought, was acting a little strangely. He didn't seem comfortable. He seemed very intense. But again, I didn't pay too much attention because a lot of people sometimes behave that way in a crowd. And then I left after the speech before the murder occurred, and I didn't know about it till I got home and heard it on the news and saw it on television.
These are the great tragedies of life. I had invited Raoul Felder, a former prosecutor, with members of his office. We walked over together. It was the first time he met Rabbi Kahane at my introduction. He also left early. So the 2 of you left early, and I was left there alone with this maniac. But the reason he was caught was not only by God's hand, wasn't such luck. A young man by the name of Gottesman chased him after a hero by the name of Franklin, 70 years old, pinned him around the waist, and for his trouble he got shot in the thigh. And then Noser, after intimidating this whole room of young spectators, tried to hijack a taxi, after the taxi meant for him by Abu Lahima was sent away by the agents of the hotel, since the taxi didn't belong there. So he tried to get into the wrong taxi with a Hispanic or Chinese driver who couldn't speak English, and Gottesman chased him out of that one, and then he was chased into the postal inspector with cries of gun, and the OK Corral took place right then and there in the streets of Manhattan. And Costa, the postal inspector, was great enough a shot that while he was wounded, he got one off into Nosair with the same type of gun that unfortunately killed Rabbi Kahana, and Jewish doctors saved Nosair's life. I know you've got so many awards. I can't read them all. The New York City Police Department Honor Legion, the Police Department's Patriotism Honor from the American Federation, a Merit Award, the Certificate of Bravery. They'll never accuse me of applying for such things. The National Law Enforcement Institute Investigation Award, the Fraternal Order of Police Law Enforcement Award, the Lifetime Achievement Award for parole officers, Medal of Valor for parole officers, Our Lady of Victory, Rosary Altar Society Criminal Justice Award, the Emerald Society, I've been to that, Distinguished Service Award, the Columbia Association Brotherhood Award, the Council of Jewish Organizations Community Service Award, the Ebony Society Fellowship Award, the Federation of Italian American Organizations JFK American Heritage Award. Over 80 commendations and awards from New York State divisions, and so on and so on. You had over 1,400 members in your union, and so on and so forth. And it sounds like our organization of brotherhood ourselves. So I'd like to ask you, why do you think there are not as many Jews there today? We have about 2 minutes. And who were the great Jews in investigation and so on in the FBI and all that?
Well, again, I mentioned their names, and certainly as far as the police force, the legendary chief of detectives, he's about 87 today, living in Florida, Albert Seidman, his book was published several years ago under the title Chief. I think many Jews are not aware of these positions. I think a lot of them, because of their backgrounds, they're not tuned into law enforcement, which is unfortunate. I know when I grew up, most of the Jewish boys and girls, their fathers were not in civil service at all. They didn't have any relatives in civil service. They didn't have any friends or relatives in law enforcement. And right now, I think in the New York City Police Department, out of about 37,000 police, the Shomrim Society, they have a membership of approximately 1,000 to 1,500, which is not a lot out of 37,000. And again, these positions are there, and I encourage Jewish young men and women to apply for these positions. If you want, I have the phone numbers of some of the personnel offices. If not, they could simply look it up in the phone book, U.S. Civil Service Commission.
We have to say goodnight,
right.
and I want to thank you very much for coming on. I wish you continued success, and to our police and law enforcement. God bless you all, and we should continue to be safe.
Thank you. My condolences to you for your aunt's passing.
Thank you.